Hello, friends, and welcome to the Season 1 finale of Misshelved, your bi-weekly dose of bookstore love. I'm your host, Nicole Brinkley, and before I get into today's incredible episode, I wanted to get some housekeeping out of the way. First off, thank you all of you who have listened to Season 1 of Misshelved. Thank you to those of you who have shared it with your friends. Thank you to those of you who reviewed us on Apple Podcasts, especially Ari, who wrote a lovely review in which they called us great for book lovers of all types. And thank you for those of you who've listened quietly and consistently. It's been a genuine delight to bring you this show, and it brings me so much joy to know people are listening. Misshelved will be back with another 10 episodes for Season 2 in July. But don't worry, I have some bonus content to tide you over. We'll have an episode of book recommendations from our Season 1 booksellers and a Patreon-exclusive episode of book recommendations from our Season 1 authors. We'll also have 2 special Misshelved Pride episodes in June where a queer bookseller sits down with a queer author to talk about queer books. There's a special rainbow version of the logo. I'm very excited. I can't wait to introduce you all to more independent booksellers and to let you listen in on their brilliant, funny, and nuanced conversations. Thank you. And without further ado, our independent bookseller for today is Rebecca Kim Wells.
I'm Rebecca Kim Wells. I'm a sometimes bookseller at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I'm also the author of the Shatter the Sky duology, Shatter the Sky and Storm the Earth, and a forthcoming book coming 2021 called Briar Girls.
Rebecca is an author and a bookseller, in addition to being one of my friends, and is absolutely brilliant. She also reads more voraciously than anybody I've ever met, save maybe Liberty Hardy from the All the Books podcast. Her author partner for today is the legendary Kate Elliott.
Hi, I'm Kate Elliott. I have been writing for a while. My most recent book is Unconquerable Sun, which I like to call gender-spun Alexander the Great in space. I write mostly adult science fiction fantasy.
Listen in as these 2 incredible minds do a deep dive on fantasy world building and the power of the fictional to reflect our reality.
Well, I do have a question for you after having read 8 of your books back to back. You're so great at world building. How do you do that?
You know, I wanna start by pointing out that you have done that very well yourself in Shatter the Sky, because I can still imagine that world in my head when I think about the story. And I read it over a year and a half ago, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a while now.
Yeah. Thought about this a lot over the years, and my philosophy of world building has changed over the years, even if I'm still maybe doing it more or less the same as I started out with, but how I talk about it has changed. I'm doing a video cast monthly series in which I'm in conversation with another writer. It's called Narrative Worlds, and it's about world building. I just did one with Toddy Thompson, and I said that I used to think that world building was about facts, the facts that the reader needed to know. And that now I think that world building is about the experience that you want the reader to have. And my core way of developing a world is to think about how the characters see themselves in the context of the setting they're in, not how I see them, but how they are in their culture and in their cultures, because they might be in more than one. It's not about whether I believe what they're doing, but whether they believe what they're doing. And I find that if I start from that basis, thinking about it from there, then that kind of helps me not so much impose my views on them, although I'm going to do that anyway, because I think we can't help but do that as writers. You know, we have our own ways of looking at things that we maybe haven't examined, you know, the unexamined assumptions that kind of trail us all the time. So I start there with that intersection between character and setting.
And I also noticed as I was reading all of these books that a lot of your main characters are biracial, and they're sort of placed right in between 2 different cultures that then interact and collide in interesting ways. Is that part of it, just to have them interact with these worlds that you're building?
That's something that I didn't realize until recently, that I was doing so much. And part of it, I think, is because my mother is an immigrant and she came to the US when she was 21. So she came from one culture and came into another culture. And so this idea of rubbing against things, it has always fascinated me, in large part, I think it's because I lived it growing up. Also, I think that it's the conflict. A lot of times when people talk about having conflict in books, they talk about violence. And
Mm-hmm.
I think both of us have written stories where there is violence. It's very much a part of our kind of narrative idea of here in the US about what is narratively interesting. But there's other kinds of conflict. And it's like that jagged edge where things are rubbing against each other. To me, it's endlessly fascinating. And it's also a great way to expose world building.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you do that with Shatter the Sky, where she comes from one place that she knows well, and then she has to learn about this new place she's gone.
Yeah, and certainly one of the reasons that I was drawn to doing that is because I am also a biracial person, and I was like, I just want to put that in there. That seems like a good idea. I mean, so much of world building is looking through your character's eyes and seeing what they see, especially when you're writing first person, as Shatter the Sky is. And some of your books are too.
Most of my early books were in third person because that was really all that was being done for a long time in the adult science fiction fantasy market. And I have to say that young adult has really broken open narrative, what used to be called experimental, like present tense, like first person present tense. If you told me 20 years ago I would have written a book in first person present tense, I would never have believed you. That was some weird experimental literary thing that people only did at the Iowa Writers Workshop, right? Now it's standard, and people have adapted. Readers today, they just don't think about how that narrative's coming in. They just adapt to what's there. It's very flexible. And young adult has been very flexible about that, more so than older, more established genres. Although young adult isn't a genre, but you know what I mean.
I think the young adult category, one of the things that makes it a very interesting place to play around in is that publishing, of course, is an entrenched industry in many ways, but you can sort of throw things around and experiment in young adults in a way that other categories sometimes frown upon, I think.
Well, you must see that as a bookseller.
Oh, yeah. Definitely. I think my two favorite places in the bookstore are probably young adult and then adult sci-fi and fantasy. I think there's so much just super cool stuff happening in sci-fi fantasy right now. It's a very exciting time to be a reader and a writer.
It is. And I think even 10 years ago, well, I don't even know what year it is. I mean, I know what year it is because this is the year that lasted a decade. But yeah, in 2010, 2008, 2010, even 2012, the stuff that's happening now in the adult SNF market just wouldn't have gotten traction. At best, it could have been maybe a micro press, right? Or a small press doing something experimental. And now it's just exploding.
I remember because Cold Magic came out in 2010. Yeah, 2010. Yeah. I have it in front of me. I remember reading it very close to when it was published, and I loved it. I was like, oh my gosh, like what is going on in this world? I love it so much. And then I actually didn't read it again until this past week when I was preparing for this podcast. And I picked it up and I was like, I wonder what this experience is going to be like. And I loved it even more.
Oh, thank you.
That was 10 years ago, which is a long time. But for me, that's like the period of time between from when I transitioned from being a serious reader into being a serious writer and published author. I was always reading books avidly, but now when I read books, I can see the construction a little bit better, if that makes sense.
It does.
And picking up these books that I read a while ago and reading them again and finding so much expert craftsmanship and like, oh my gosh, I love this book already. Now I love it even more. How did you do this? I would like to know, actually, particularly about cold magic. Where did Rory come from?
Well, I don't know. Rory brought himself into the story literally. If anyone is listening to this who don't know, Cold Magic is the first of a trilogy. It's an alternate history fantasy, which means it's set in our world in approximately 1818, I think, or thereabouts. So late Regency feel to it. It's an alternate history with magic in which an extended ice age meant that there's no Germanic peoples of any kind. So Europe is an Afro-Celtic cultural setting with the dregs of the Roman Empire, and the Carthaginians weren't destroyed by the Romans. So the main character is a descendant of Carthaginians. And there's a spirit world. And anyway, that's kind of the setting. And at one point, the main character, Kat, crosses into the spirit world. She's fleeing across this landscape that isn't our Earth and is this kind of weird spirit world with all this weird stuff going on. And at some point, she begins to be shadowed by and then even protected by a little pride of saber-toothed cats, the big ones. And at the end of this whole sequence, she's able to cross back into our world. And behind her comes this young man who, it turns out, was one of the saber-toothed cats. He leaped in after her. But to be honest with you, I didn't plan it. Literally, and this is one reason I have to write first drafts the way I do, because I can't outline, because stuff happens to me while I'm writing. You know, I'm typing and it's like the cat jumped through after her.
Okay, so
and there
we
he
need
was.
to talk more about this. So many questions, but the first one is the family of saber-toothed cats, though, like their relationship to her, you know, has a huge bearing on the plot and the existence of Rory. So did you know that relationship before he followed her out?
I wrote that a long time ago. I'm not sure. I leave a lot of openings in my first drafts. I know people who plot out their whole first drafts and then they're basically taking dictation. I think of them as Mozart authors, right? Mm-hmm. So Mozart would write his whole scores and they would basically be perfect when he was done writing them out. And then there's Beethoven authors, and the Beethoven would be, you know, writing things and scribbling it out and changing stuff. Evidently his manuscripts were a mess. And for me, a first draft is where I find out stuff. I'm like telling myself the world and the story and the characters at the same time. And connections are somehow made for me while I'm working at that point. I quickly figured out, I knew that they were going to protect her. How much of that I understood. But as soon as Rory arrived, maybe it was when he arrived, when he jumped after her, maybe that's when it all dropped into place for me in the first draft.
Oh, I love that. So when you're writing first drafts, what do you know at the beginning if you're discovering so much as you're writing?
Isn't this the most interesting question for every writer? Because it's all so different. I have to have a character and I have to have a basic sense of a setting. It doesn't have to be fleshed out yet, but it has to be something that I can hang my hooks on. Where do you start?
I used to be like, I mean, I guess I still am, but I used to be super obsessed with fairy tales. And so every one of my ideas would be like a fairy tale reimagining. So that's where my ideas used to come from. And in fact, the book that's coming out next year, that's how it started. Mm-hmm. So there was, you know, a character inspired by Rapunzel and Sleeping Beauty and Jack and the Beanstalk and the Little Mermaid. It's a big mess. But now I've sort of like teased out what I want it to be. It's very exciting. But for Shadow the Sky, it was actually very different because I actually was on submission for that other book. And I was like, I need to start writing, but I was so much of an emotional wreck by being on submission that was very hard for me to feel excited and creative. So I was doing a lot of reading and I was reading different books and I picked up Mark Kurlansky's Salt. I don't know if you've read that one.
That's a nonfiction book, right?
Yeah. So it's an adult book. It's a microhistory. He sort of is tracing the history of humans based on their interactions with salt and how they like would produce salt and salt in the economy and that sort of thing. there was a chapter about this whole town that their main trade was just this production and sale of salt. And I was like, that's interesting. What if that, except dragons? What if there was a town that their whole trade or their thing was dragons, and then what if somehow that was taken away from them? And then, if that was taken away from them, then who took it away from them and why? And, you sort of see the story unfolding from there, as you said.
This explains why I instantly felt at home, because this is the geeky world building foundational stuff that I adore. I just adore it, because you can see that I'm really interested in how worlds work and why people do things. And as you said, how cultures interact or don't interact, right? And, and where is the salt coming from? I know not everybody loves that, but I love that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I remember you talking about black wolves, actually, and the way in which you used rice production as like a major plot point.
Yes.
Which is so you. And that to me is so intimidating as a writer, because I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't know anything about rice production.
I don't know if anyone here has read Ken Liu's Dandelion Dynasty epic fantasy.
I've got the first one on my shelf, but I have not read it yet.
So Ken ups this about 198%. First of all, it's a great trilogy. The other thing I have to say, probably to this audience, is if you do read it, I would say in book 1, The Grace of Kings, be aware that he's doing something very deliberately and specific with the treatment of women in the first half of the book. So you think that there's no women, they have very cliched roles, but it's going somewhere. But he talks about technology, and the progress of technology in that book is a major thing. And he really gets into it. I love it. But you have to really like to read about, how did they develop these batteries? How do they create, printing press? And how does technology and work in the sense of creating progress? And how does it spread through people? Anyway, so he's super into that.
I'm certainly into it as a reader, and I am very intimidated and not into it as a writer.
I wanted to circle back to something interesting. We were talking about young adult being, in some ways, a more innovative narrative form. And you mentioned that you had read Cold Magic in 2010. And I wanted to note, just for the record, that an epic fantasy in 3 volumes, told from a first person, although first person, past tense point of view. And it's not that doesn't exist in science fiction and fantasy, it does. But the way it was told and the way it was focused on how she sees the world, which is not like some dude seeing the world, right? She sees it through her very distinct lens. That book was not really picked up and embraced by what I'll call the mainstream adult science fiction fantasy community. It kind of languished for about 6 months until it crossed over into the romance and young adult communities. And they were the ones who embraced it and pumped it up and that's when it started getting read more widely. Isn't that interesting?
It is very interesting, and it doesn't surprise me at all, actually, looking back at it, because I do remember the first time I read it being very struck by the world building. And then when I reread it, I was like, but this is such a great, coming of age story of these 2 young women. Yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all. That makes perfect sense. I also love, speaking of the romances, what I loved about Kat's romance in that series, and also Jess's romance in the Court of Fives trilogy, is the ways in which the people that they're in a relationship with are in places of power, and they're fundamentally good people, but also trapped in some ways in those places, such that they can't really see the possibility of change as much as our main characters can. I loved that.
I'm a big believer in the importance of science fiction and fantasy as a lens to talk about the world we live in. In old school science fiction, it was all about we're going to predict the future. And yet those writers from those days, they never really did. So if you look at all these brilliant future predictions from the 40s and 50s and into the 60s written by men, none of them predicted the pill, right? Or, that women could be freed from the need to get pregnant every time they had sex, right? That just wasn't on their radar. The changing status of gender in the West, you just don't see that in those old stories. Or if you do, it's very rare. Not to mention there were women who were writing back then whose stories got dropped out of the canon. I think that science fiction isn't as innovative as it necessarily, or hasn't always been as innovative about the future as it necessarily thinks it has, because it's really about the present. We're really talking about ourselves and looking at ourselves through this really interesting filter. And one of the great things it can do, and you do this with Shatter the Sky, is it talks about power. It gives us a way to view power that lets us step out one step and view it kind of from a distance of this alternate setting.
One thing I will say about Storm the Earth, I wrote it during 2019, and I was already angry about the state of United States politics at the beginning of 2019, but as the year went on, I just got angrier and angrier and angrier. That anger absolutely informed the way that I wrote Storm the Earth and what went into the plot and what happened to the people in power and the way that the climactic sequence of the book unfolded. And then, after it was mostly done, I got even angrier. And I think sometimes about the way the book might be different if I were writing it now instead of last year. And it's a very weird feeling because the book exists, it's out there. But in my mind, I'm like, oh, I like it. I could have been angrier. I could have done more things differently.
But that's fascinating to think about, that we write the book that we're capable of writing, or that we have in us to write because of who we are and our skill level, but also what's going on around us at that moment. And the book 5 years later, it wouldn't be the same book.
That was kind of a downer of a moment for me to realize, feeling like I hesitated before reaching the top, stopping before I got to the top of the mountain. No, like at the time when I was writing it, that was the top of the mountain. And just for me, a lot of things have changed in the last year. My perspective on the world, that was me last year, and now this is me this year, and we'll see what happens in the future. I don't know.
But absolutely. See, you are, just as you speak there, the absolute argument for the importance of art being something that happens over a long period of time, because each time we come to art, we come to it differently than we did the last time we came to it, even if we're writing a book a year. And how wonderful that you got to write that book then, at that moment of you, right?
Yeah.
Because now you can write a book with this new moment of you. I mean, that's why I love this idea that people, not everybody has the chance to write across, many years, but it's one of the things that I'm grateful for, that I've had a chance to write across a span of time, because I can tell myself new stories. I have different insights to give. And so you have that opportunity to see this in this book, where you were then as an artist, and now to move to a different place.
I hope so. How have your priorities and aims as an artist changed? Or any reflections on your journey that you'd like to share? I'm so in awe of that you write such wonderful things and that you continue to do so.
I've had some rough times in a field that hasn't always been welcoming or generous to certain writers. But I think to some extent, I wrote what I wanted to write, which meant what I wanted to see. And I wrote in conversation with what I had read and what I was reading. So I think that conversation changes over time. I can look at my older books and see things that I just would not write them that way now. But I'm also not tempted to go in and say, well, I'm going to rewrite this to make it fit more how I think would be, that makes me uncomfortable that I wrote that, right? Mm-hmm. Oh, that looks kind of bigoted or whatever, right? I mean, this just because the world has changed so much and so many attitudes have changed. And as an artist, you're part of that. You can't take yourself out of what the world was like 30 years ago. I mean, unless you weren't born then, right? But then you're being raised by people who were alive then. And so we have to, I think as a writer, what I've learned is you've got to embrace the journey, to embrace the sense. As you were saying, you think, well, I could have written something different if I was writing it now. But it's important that you wrote it then. It's important that we mark those stages in the journey, and that as we go along, the Crossroads books, the ones that start with Spirit Gate, those are kind of in some ways my darkest trilogy, because I was writing that directly to argue with the way women were treated in so much of the epic fantasy that I love. Mm-hmm. And the way we're treated as disposable in so much of the fantasy I loved. So I wrestled with that. I wouldn't write that book now for various reasons, but I'm so glad I wrote it then. So for you, I would just say, write the book that's there right now, in your heart, in your mind to write, and be glad for it. And I would say that to anybody here who's writing, be glad for what is there now, because it's going to be different next year. And that's how it's supposed to be.
I love that. And I think that Nicole is reminding us that perhaps it's time to wrap up. I could probably talk to you for like a full hour on every single one of your books. So I think this is like very short for us. I think we've done very well.
It's been delightful to talk to you.
Thank you. Well, I loved talking to you too. Where can we find you and your books on the internet?
I do have a webpage, which is www.kateelliott.com, 2 L's, 2 T's. I have a Substack newsletter, which is rarely more than once a month at the most. And I am on Twitter at Kate Elliott SFF, and that's science fiction fantasy. And how about you?
I am findable at my website, which is RebeccaWellsWrites.com. And I'm on the Twitter and the Instagram at Rebecca Writing, and that's writing like writing a book, not riding a horse. I also have a newsletter, which you can sign up for just by visiting my website. Thank you so much for listening.
We appreciate you.
If you liked today's episode, don't forget to rate, subscribe, and tell a friend about Misshelved. To keep up to date with all of our bookish hijinks, follow us at Misshelved Pod on Twitter and Instagram. If you really like what happens here, and we hope you do, head over to our Patreon page to help fund this podcast and our Misshelved newsletter. Thank you for listening, and as always, happy reading.